Thank you so much, Johanna. So before I begin with the topic of today's talk, I want to first thank you all for attending. I look forward to the questions that you bring, and I hope that I can provide an informative and interesting discussion on the subject of war crimes and war criminals. Second, I would also like to acknowledge that I'm a settler scholar presenting this talk from the shared traditional territories of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. This land is part of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty between the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples and symbolizes the agreement to share, protect resources, and not to engage in conflict. This land is also a part of the Haldimand Proclamation of 1784, signed by the British and their allies, the Six Nations, after the American Revolution, which granted this land to the Six Nations for them and their posterity to enjoy forever. Despite being the largest preserved demographically in Canada, those nations now reside on less than 5% of this original territory. And now I know many of you may not have heard of land acknowledgments, especially in England. So you may be wondering what the point of all of this is. For me, for what I study and with how I engage with the legal history of Canada, it is crucial for me to understand the land we call Canada today and how it was established as a settler colony. But what exactly does that mean? According to Patrick Wolfe, author of Settler Colonialism and the Transformation of Anthropology, seen here on the left of your screen, settler colonialism is an ongoing system of power that maintains the repression of Indigenous peoples and cultures to establish a claim on the land and replace their presence with a Eurocentric presence. But these aren't just events of the past. Instead, colonial, quote, invasion is a structure, not an event, end quote, and it stretches across time and space. The erasure and removal of Indigenous peoples, presence, and culture from the land and replacing them with first British subjects, and then those who be classified as good Canadians, is central to how settler colonialism has been carried out in Canada. And this idea of good Canadian comes up again later in my talk. For my own work, centering Canada as a settler colonial nation is imperative to understanding the policies, laws, and social practices at play in the construction of nation. And I also think it is important to reflect on my own place and role within this system as a settler on these lands who benefits from this system. As citizens of a colonial nation and as part of the system, I think we need to strive to do better, to listen and to make changes, such as engaging with and carrying out the 94 calls for action in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission published in 2012, and the title page is on your screen as well. I'm happy to talk further about this in the question period if anyone is curious. But now on to the topic of today's discussion. So as my title suggests, today I'm going to speak about war crimes and war criminals, specifically Canada's response to Nazi war crimes and Nazi war criminals in the post-World War II era. The presence of alleged war criminals in Canada has been the subject of controversy on and off since the end of the Second World War, and has really drawn attention at a few key moments. The first being during the Eichmann trial in 1960-61. You can see his image here on the screen. This trial really introduced the world to the full scale of the Holocaust and was a reminder that the perpetrators of those crimes had not all faced justice. The second was a resurgence in action against alleged war criminals starting in the 1970s and 80s. With the creation of the Office of Special Investigation in 1979 in the United States, the Commission of Inquiry on War Criminals in Canada in 1985, and in Britain, an inquiry in 1989 led to the creation of the War Crimes Act in 1991, which was invoked after some dispute and passed only by the authority of the House of Commons. In Canada, how the country should respond to war criminals and war crimes has been the center of a rather heated debate that has pitted communities against one another. And I talked about this more in my dissertation, but I'm not going to focus on it today. This debate over justice played out in the news and in various courtrooms, including the proceedings of the 1985 Royal Commission tasked with investigating the matter. But today, I really want to historicize for you how Canada has responded to questions of war crimes and war criminals in the past to show how the nature of justice in such cases is not so clear-cut. I would also like to make a quick note on the terminology I use before going further into this topic. For this talk, the definition of war crimes I use is that codified in the Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907 and in the Nuremberg Tribunal of 1945. I include the Nuremberg definitions in my broad definition of war crimes as those proceedings further expanded on the definition of war crimes and added crimes against humanity and crimes against peace into precedent in international law. And you can see those on your screen. For the purposes of this discussion, I also limit my working definition to Nazi war crimes and the crimes committed by their collaborators during the Second World War, following the definition from the Nuremberg Tribunal. And I do this merely as a bookend. Other war crimes have been committed outside of those that the Nazis engaged in, but I'm not talking about those today. So there are three distinctive periods of judicial action with which the Canadian state engaged in their response to war criminals in the country. The first is that of the immediate post-war, roughly from 1945 through to about 1950. During this time period, Canada was actively engaged in judicial proceedings against war criminals and participated in investigations into war crimes and conducted their own military trials. In the second time period, that of about 1950 through 1975-80, there was a limited response. Canada had concluded their forays into post-war justice, and despite some attempts by private organizations and individuals, there was limited action towards allegations of war criminals within the country. In the final period, from 1980 to present, there was a renewed focus on alleged war criminals that had migrated into the country. Canada established the Commission of Inquiry on War Criminals in 1985 and instigated judicial proceedings against some of the individuals whose cases were investigated by the Commission. Throughout this discussion, I hope to impart a greater understanding of Canada's response to war criminals and show that regardless of where you stand in the debate about justice in these cases, justice is rarely simple. And while I'm talking solely about Canada in this talk, I will say that Great Britain and the United States engaged in similar ways of responding and at similar time periods, and I will try to make mention of their responses as it coincides with the Canadian cases that I'm going to discuss, but I'm happy to talk about that a little bit further in the question period. So the immediate post-war period. In the aftermath of the Second World War, Canada tried a total of 7 German servicemen for war crimes committed against Canadian military personnel. The most infamous of these trials was the Canadian Armed Forces trial against Brigadefuhrer General Kurt Meyer. Meyer was charged with 5 counts of committing a war crime for his role as the commanding officer of soldiers who killed Canadian troops held as prisoners of war in Normandy, France. The other 6 defendants, Robert Holzer, Walter Weigel, Wilhelm Ossenbach, Johann Nietz, Wilhelm Young, and Johann Schumacher, were charged for war crimes and accessory to war crimes for their roles in the deaths of Canadian airmen. The sentences in these cases range from several years hard labor in prison to the death sentence. With the exception of the Meyer case, the cases received little attention in Canadian media or even in government circles. The Canadian war crimes trials conducted in Newark, Germany, allow us to look more closely at Canada's efforts to engage in international affairs and post-war reconstruction. By conducting their own trials, rather than just allowing the British to carry out trials, the Canadian state was effectively asserting its independence as an international agent. These trials show a country that was trying to engage in justice on the international stage, but was also focused on demobilization and moving on from the war. The Meyer trial in particular is of great importance to later Canadian responses towards allegations of war criminals. When combined with Canada's role in the Nuremberg trials, Canada could point to a moment where they engaged with post-war justice as ably as the United States and Great Britain, though not at the same scale or proceedings. This point of fact would be referenced time and again in later moments, as Canada equivocated in the response to allegations of war criminals resident within the country. Even prior to the end of hostilities in Europe, the Allied powers were discussing legal avenues available to them. The failure of policy after the First World War to prevent another war weighed heavily upon them, and post-war trials were viewed as the most viable option to achieve justice. And you will see one of the most famous photos of one of the most famous trials on your screen. In an effort to collect information on war crimes and to proceed to trial, the United Nations War Crimes Commission was established. Made up of 17 member nations, including Canada, the UNWCC investigated war crimes conducted during the war and was operational from 1943 through 1948. The UNWCC aided with over 2,000 trials and accused over 36,000 individuals of war crimes. While the collaborative efforts of its member nations generated a significant contribution to international law in the development of standards and proceedings, National interests of its members soon put pressure on the UNWCC to expedite their work and wrap up trials as quickly as possible. Of note for our topic today, the UNWCC investigations led to mounting evidence against two Brigadefuhrer generals, Kurt Meyer and Wilhelm Mohnke, for the deaths of Canadian servicemen in Normandy. Meyer was located and stood trial. However, Mohnke could not be located. Later, it was discovered that Soviet forces had captured Mohnke and transferred him to an officers' prisoner camp where he would remain until October 1955. From here, he moved to Warsbüttel, West Germany, where he remained until his death in August 2001 at the age of 90. He never did face Canadian justice. On December 10th, 1945, under the jurisdiction of Major General H.W. Foster, the trial against Kurt Meyer commenced, and Kurt Meyer is seen on the screen here being escorted to the courtroom. Lieutenant Colonel MacDonald served as lead prosecution as well as lead investigator due to his work as a lawyer before the war. And the transcripts of the trial provide an interesting account of the way that the Canadian court used international law. The Canadian trials used military law to try Meyer via court-martial. As noted in court transcripts, Meyer was charged with 5 counts of committing a war crime, for counseling his troops to deny quarter to Allied troops, and for his responsibility for the killings of 48 Canadian prisoners of war. The full charge sheet is on the screen. Based on the testimonies from men under his command, from civilians in Normandy, and from interviews with Meyer himself, the court found Meyer guilty of 3 of the 5 counts against him, the 1st, 4th, and 5th charges. Brigadefuhrer General Meyer was sentenced to death by being shot. However, this sentence was commuted after further thought by Major General Vaux. Meyer was moved to a Canadian penitentiary in Dorchester, New Brunswick, to carry out his now life sentence. In early 1951, Meyer was returned to Germany, where he was to remain a prisoner under the jurisdiction of the British in a British-operated prison in Werl, Germany. The commutation of his sentence and later reduction of Meyer's sentence were not well received in Canada. On November 26, 1951, debate in the House of Commons arose over Meyer's apparent freedom in the British-controlled prison. Mr. Drew, leader of the opposition, pointed out that Kurt Meyer was found guilty of the responsibility for the deaths of certain Canadians. Either he was guilty or he was not. If he was guilty, there was a form of punishment provided. If he was not guilty, he should be freed. There should be no intermediate stage, end quote. The debate within bureaucratic circles centered on the rule of law and was quite extensive. Meyer was a prisoner and should be treated as one. He should not be released for weeks at a time to visit his family. In 1954, Meyer's case was again brought up in the House of Commons, as Meyer's sentence was commuted further to a term of 14 years, subject to reduction for good conduct, as the said Kurt Meyer may have earned. On September 7th, 1954, Meyer, seen on bottom left, was released from prison based on the aforementioned recommendation. The Canadian government had agreed to commute his sentence from life imprisonment to a sentence of 14 years, of which he would only serve 10. Many remained bitter about the release of Meyer. His lack of regret and his display of pride for military service annoyed many Canadians who felt that Meyer had escaped the punishment necessary for his role in the deaths of Canadian soldiers. After his release, Meyer was unable to return to a career in the military or even to begin a political career. He suffered from various illnesses, including arthritis and heart disease. On December 23, 1961, just 7 years after his release from prison, he died, leaving behind a controversial legacy. After the trial against Meyer, the armed forces concluded their venture into trying cases of war crimes. After some discussion about whether to discontinue the trials altogether, the Royal Canadian Air Force decided to establish their own court, also in Newark, to try cases related to the mistreatment of Canadian airmen. In March 1946, the RCAF brought forth charges of 3 members of the armed forces of the German Reich with committing war crimes. The defendants, Robert Holzer, Walter Weigel, and Wilhelm Ossenbach, were charged in the deaths of 3 Canadian prisoners of war near Opladen, Germany. Based on the evidence gathered, Ossenbach was found guilty and sentenced to 15 years in prison. He was released in 1952. Weigel was also found guilty, this time for the express death of a Canadian airman, and was executed for his crime. Robert Holzer, who was a senior officer in command, was found the most culpable in the deaths of the 3 Canadian airmen, and he was also sentenced to death. The other 3 defendants brought before the RCAF court in Newark were sentenced. Neitz to life in prison, Young was sentenced to death, and Schumacher was found guilty for the deaths of Canadian airmen and was also sentenced to death. When Canadian troops withdrew from Europe, further evidence about suspected war crimes was forwarded to British investigatory units for potential legal action. The Canadian trials had reached their end. The military trials conducted by the Canadians at the end of the Second World War showed how Canadians interpreted the definition of war crimes through the use of international law in the courts and in the public awareness of the trials, and show that Canadians were willing and able to participate on the international stage, a point that would be a point of pride for Canada. But when the trials ended, Canada also proved eager to move on. And this was not just the case for Canada. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the British conducted at least 6 trials with 28 accused in 1947 alone for war crimes committed against Canadian military personnel. Between 45 and 49, British forces conducted approximately 356 trials involving more than 100 Nazi war criminals. In the American zone of occupation, it was reported that approximately 3,800 case files were opened, and around 1,600 individuals were brought to trial before American military courts in over 489 different cases. However, both the British and American governments were eager to move on from this war and had already established plans for their futures. The British cabinet concluded that no further trials were to be conducted after August 31st, 1948, though trials started before that date could be completed. And in reference to this decision, the British Commonwealth Relations Office sent a telegram to the 7 Dominions suggesting that they conclude all war crimes trials and that the matter of war crimes trials should come to an end. Referenced several times in the Commission of Inquiry on War Criminals in Canada, the British telegram stated, quote, "In our view, the punishment of war criminals is more a matter of discouraging future generations than of meting out retribution of every guilty individual. Moreover, in view of future political developments in Germany envisaged by recent tripartite talks, we are convinced that it is now necessary to dispose of the past as soon as possible," end quote. War crimes trials were seemingly at an end. When the war crimes trials in Europe came to an end in 1948, various governments, including Canada, felt the matter was at a close. Many individuals, mainly private citizens, continued the pursuit for war criminals and lobbied governments to continue the judicial process, particularly against the war criminals that had fled justice in post-war Europe and made their way to other places. You will probably know about the exodus of alleged Nazi war criminals to South America, but some came to Canada, to the United States, to Great Britain. Some war criminals enter Canada via clandestine government programs like Operation Matchbox, titled the same in the UK, and in the United States it was called Operation Paperclip. And you can see some of their members in the bottom image on your screen, as these are German rocket scientists in Texas brought over via Operation Paperclip for use in the space program. And I can talk more about these programs in the questions if anyone is interested. Other alleged war criminals entered alongside the thousands of displaced persons who migrated to Canada seeking a fresh start. And you can see a group of DPs in the top image. They came to Pier 21 in Halifax, Canada in 1951. The federal government committed to accept significant numbers of post-war displaced persons from camps throughout Europe and allowed for more than 157,000 refugees to migrate to Canada between 1945 and 51. Questions about who these DPs were and how they would integrate in Canadian society were at the forefront and were cause of some concern. In an opinion poll conducted by the Canadian Institute of Public Opinion in October 1946, Canadians were asked what their opinion was on immigration. Participants were asked, if Canada does allow more migrants, are there any of these nationalities you would like to keep out? And as you can see, a list was provided. The Japanese were at the top of the list, with 60% of respondents voting for their exclusion. 49% of those interviews wanted to prevent Jewish migration into the country. And in third, with only 34%, were German nationals. As you can see, the list also includes Ukrainian, Polish, and other Eastern European countries that had high percentages of Jewish immigrants wanting to leave their homelands. These answers are indicative of the general unease felt in the immediate post-war period, particularly about immigration and how potential migrants would fit into Canadian society. For Canadians, on a subconscious level perhaps, the assimilability of potential migrants based on language, religion, and race played a key role in how such groups would be received. As historian Franca Iacovetta has pointed out in her monograph Gatekeepers, Canadian agents of immigration worked to select and mold potential newcomers according to, quote, Anglo-Canadian middle-class ideals, end quote. Migrants were screened to prevent the entry of unwanted persons, and there were lists of wanted war criminals available to immigration agents. Yet some still gained entry using false identities, forged paperwork, and by concealing their wartime activities, as we will see. In Howard Margolian's Unauthorized Entry, he estimates that, quote, only 1% of the more than 150,000 European refugees admitted to Canada between 1946 and 1951 were suspected Nazi war criminals, end quote. But by that estimate, some 1,500 Nazi war criminals may have entered Canada, and some remained here, made a life here, and some were even granted citizenship. Now, an example of an individual who came to Canada under false pretenses is the case of Helmut Rauka, seen here on your screen on your left. Helmut Rauka was a member of the SS and served in Lithuania. In the summer of 1941, Rauka was sent to Kaunas, Lithuania, where according to the German charge sheet against him, he was, quote, the agent responsible for Jewish affairs and participated in the mass extermination of the Jewish population, end quote. This was some 10,000 people. In 1950, he found passage on a Canadian ship called the Beaver Bray that brought DP migrants to Canada. Rauka had modified his service record and told screening officials that he was in Kaunas months after the massacre. He also switched around his given names as an added precaution. He was granted Canadian citizenship in 1956. In Canada, Rauka worked various jobs, including employment as a motel manager, and he even operated a catering company for a while. But authorities in the Federal Republic of Germany were searching for him. They began this search as early as 1961, but he managed to avoid detection for nearly 40 years. In 1982, Rauka was located in Canada and charged with committing war crimes. Rauka eventually abandoned the appeal process, gave up his citizenship, and was flown to Frankfurt for trial. Before the trial could begin, though, Rauka died of natural causes in a prison hospital. Rauka was able to gain entry to Canada and gain citizenship by omitting details about his war record. Though this admission was ground for revocation of citizenship, in theory, if not exactly in practice, this example shows how alleged war criminals were able to gain access to Canada. Throughout the 1950s until the 1980s, little attention was given to allegations that war criminals might be in Canada. Private citizens voiced their concerns, and in 1978, a bill to respond to war criminals in Canada never reached a second reading in the House. Canada did not want to hear any more about war criminals, a sentiment that was shared by many nations, including the United States and Great Britain in this time period. But the 1982 arrest of Helmut Rauka gained substantial attention and signals the start of our final time period, that of renewed interest in judicial action for war criminals. In January 1985, an article was printed in the New York Times that claimed that the infamous Nazi doctor Joseph Mengele might be hiding in Canada. Speculation that Mengele, the notorious angel of death who conducted horrific experiments on prisoners of Auschwitz under the guise of his role as doctor, was a very serious matter. The Americans had been searching for him for years. The Canadian government had no choice but to respond to the accusation. Judge Jules Deschênes was appointed to the head of the Commission of Inquiry on War Criminals in 1985. The commission was tasked with three objectives: to determine if Mengele was in Canada, if other alleged war criminals were resident within the country, and what legal options were available to Canada to respond to any alleged war criminals that were found. In short, the commission found that Mengele had never entered Canada, but it did find that there were other alleged war criminals in Canada and posited legal solutions for action. The commission looked into specific allegations made about the number of war criminals in Canada and gathered these from a variety of different sources. As you can see from the chart on the slide, the numbers range from a handful to several thousand. And the numbers really do depend on the source, and the commission worked to chase down every lead or accusation made about war criminals in Canada. The highest estimated figure given by Simon Wiesenthal, a kind of infamous Nazi hunter, his title for himself, in 1986 was 6,000. That's a 400% increase to the commission's master list of cases. In its own investigations, the commission master list reached 774 names. Of these, 606 files were closed after initial investigations because the suspect had either never arrived in Canada, had left Canada prior to the commission, or had died before the commission took place. And after gathering further evidence, the master list dwindled to 29 cases where, quote, the seriousness of the allegations and the availability of evidence warranted special attention, end quote. These names and the evidence were released to the federal government and to select members of the RCMP and the Department of Justice in a confidential report for further action. While the commission had a tangible list of cases to pursue, it was conflicted about how to legally proceed against the suspects. The commission determined that there were three options to pursue justice against alleged Nazi war criminals in Canada, and these were extradition, prosecution in Canada, or denaturalization and deportation. In order of preference, extradition was viewed as the most favorable legal option because if it was requested and granted, it afforded the opportunity of a trial in a country which was most intimately connected with the crimes against the alleged suspect. Extradition was not always possible, though. If no extradition treaty was in place with the country the crimes was committed in, then according to the commission, the next best legal option was criminal prosecution in Canada. To prosecute in Canada, amendments had to be made to the criminal code, which was doable. The commission determined that the least popular legal option was denaturalization and deportation, despite this being the option used in the United States against alleged war criminals. And this option was ranked the lowest because, as Deschênes stated, quote, it does not really deal with the substantive issue of war crimes. It merely transfers the suspect to another country, provided there be one willing to accept the outcast, end quote. Not to mention, it was a very timely proceeding. The Canadian government determined that the best legal option to appease the division in Canadian society would be prosecution in Canada. So under the Canada War Crimes and Crimes Against Humanity Act, which were changes made to the criminal code in 1987, Canadian courts were eligible to pursue legal action against individuals listed in the Commission's confidential report. And the first of such cases was that of Imre Finta on the screen here. He had immigrated to Canada in 1951 and was granted citizenship in 1956. In 1987, he was charged with unlawful confinement, robbery, kidnapping, and manslaughter under the war crimes provisions in the criminal code for allegedly committing said crimes while serving as the commander of a gendarmerie in Szeged, Hungary, and assisting the Nazis during the Second World War. The case against him did not quite go as planned, though. And in 1992, Finta was acquitted in a jury trial as the Crown had failed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Finta had committed war crimes and crimes against humanity in 1944. The acquittal was upheld by the Ontario Court of Appeal and later by the Supreme Court of Canada in 1994. With this upholding of the decision, prosecution in Canada had failed. Denaturalization and deportation, though a lengthy and unfavorable process, was now the most viable option to bring forth justice to alleged war criminals in Canada and would be the legal method used in several later cases in Canada. And the final case study I would like to discuss today further exemplifies the complicated nature of justice in Canada's pursuit of Nazi war criminals. And this is the case of the Minister of Citizenship and Immigration versus Vladimir Katelyn, a denaturalization and deportation proceeding where Katelyn was charged with falsifying the records by which he had obtained a visa to enter Canada, which, if proven, were grounds for the revocation of his citizenship. Vladimir Katelyn was born in 1921 in, pardon my accent here, Luzhny Sarnauty, Romania. The town became Luzhny, Chernivtsi Oblast, Ukraine, after changing hands between Nazi and Soviet occupying forces during the war. It changed hands several times. Much of the region did. According to his own testimony, Katelyn joined a volunteer force in 1941 that marched to Kiev to attempt to liberate the area from Soviet occupation. And in 1941, many of these volunteers joined the Germans in a German-formed Battalion 115. All members of this battalion were Ukrainian. And this later was merged into a Battalion 118. Katelyn was enlisted in both. In Kiev, Katelyn said that the battalion guarded a wheat mill. The battalion was then sent to Minsk in Belarusia near the end of 1942, and in the spring of 1942 was sent to Poland for a brief time, where they remained until the Russian advance in the spring of 1944. Katrick stated that the unit was sent to maintain law and order, to protect locals from threatening partisan forces, and testified that, quote, he had never participated in any major military operations, that he had never fired his gun, end quote. In 1944, the battalion was transported to France, where they were informed that they were now part of the Waffen SS 30th Grenadier Division. From here, the story gets more interesting, as he testified that he quickly left this unit and enlisted in the French underground, where he was sent to the front to fight German forces, and he later joined the French Foreign Legion to avoid repatriation to the Soviet Union. When the war came to an end, Katrick obtained new identity papers in the name of Nicholas Spierka, the name of his brother-in-law back in Bukovina. Under his new identity, Katrick worked in Paris as a butcher. He met and married his wife, a French citizen, Maria. In 1951, the couple decided to immigrate to Canada and obtained a visa. They arrived in Quebec City in August 1951 and traveled on to Montreal. In 1958, Katrick and his wife signed applications for citizenship. In this application, Katrick applied to have his name changed back to his proper Vladimir Katrick, and him and his wife were granted citizenship under the Katrick name. Though the defendant's testimony during trial presents a reasonable narrative of his experiences during the war and his immigration to Canada, the Crown presented a different spin. The Crown prosecutor, David Lucas, argued that Katrick willingly volunteered for service in battalions 115 and 118, and that he had acted as a collaborator. In 1943, in Belarusia, where Katrick acknowledges he was stationed, German forces and collaborators committed various war crimes and crimes against humanity against the civilians and prisoners of war in the area, and the Crown argued that Katrick was likely involved in such activities. The Crown argued that Katrick's military service and the falsification of his records by which he obtained a visa for entry into Canada were grounds for the revocation of his citizenship. The idea of good character was at the heart of this denaturalization case, as it was with many. Katrick testified that he had given a false name upon entry into Canada to protect himself from the consequences of repatriation to the USSR. However, when the time came to apply for citizenship, Katrick and his wife proceeded using their proper names and were granted citizenship under the name Katrick. In the case against him, like many of the denaturalization and deportation cases, past immigration records were at the forefront of the case to determine the lawfulness of immigration. In 1945 and 1946, the Canadian government had plans about how they would screen potential migrants before entry. They were concerned about the entry of enemy aliens and of war criminals. But this conversation quickly turned towards how to best administer screening in a way to more quickly reopen Canadian borders to immigrants and tourists alike. A.L. Joliffe, Director of Departments in Mines and Resources, aka Immigration, and his counterparts worked to reopen Canada to good and desirable citizens. Katrick's 1958 application for citizenship even marked on the sheet that Katrick was of good character. Phrases about good character were used to obfuscate the reality of hierarchical ethnic preferences in Canadian immigration policy. The language and further perceptions of equality in the Canadian mythos were carried forth in the trials of alleged Nazi war criminals and further complicates conceptualizations of criminal culpability and justice. In 1999, Judge Mark Naden presented his verdict in the Katrick case. The judge decided that, quote, the respondent was not lawfully admitted to Canada for permanent residence as he had obtained his citizenship by false representation or fraud or by concealing material circumstances, end quote. Though his citizenship was in question, the judge determined there was not enough evidence to make a determination about the question of culpability in war crimes, and furthermore that that was not the reason for the court. There we go. After the court decision, the procedure was for the cabinet to review the matter and strip citizenship. And several appeals processes later, in 2007, the cabinet halted revocation proceedings, citing lack of evidence, and allowed the alien Katrick to keep his citizenship and live out the last years of his life on his bee farm in Quebec. Katrick was not left in peace, however. There were many that felt there was no justice in the decision. The verdict did not stop speculation about the case, and several Canadian papers included articles with sensational headlines about the case. Katrick died in 2015 at the age of 93. He denied the allegations against him throughout the trial and up until his death. By those in his community and his church, he was remembered as, quote, a quiet man who enjoyed his bees, end quote. And the case of Katriak really provokes questions about justice and equal treatment under the law. What justice was, and if it had been served in this case and in other similar proceedings, was a much debated topic of which there are no easy answers. There was extensive lobbying from various groups from all sides of this issue. Some wanted alleged war criminals, men like Katriak, to be found guilty on criminal charges of crimes against humanity and continued to push further, even if the judicial system found a verdict of not guilty. Other lobbyists argued that the trial, and particularly the continued allegations after a trial had concluded, were unjust and spoke to a concerted effort against their communities. What I also find interesting in these conversations about justice is how justice should be carried out, against whom, and perhaps even more perplexing, is when justice should be carried out. I hope I've shown through the case studies I've discussed today the idea of justice is complicated, and made more so when discussing how the country should respond to alleged war criminals. Today, we've looked at 3 time periods to understand how Canada has responded to war crimes in each era. In the first time period, the immediate post-war, Canadian forces conducted trials against 7 German military personnel for war crimes committed against Canadian troops. We saw that the end of the trials led to a wave of inaction during the second time period, where the focus was post-war reconstruction and renewed interest in immigration, not on a search for Nazis. The case against Helmut Rauka, which took place at the end of this time period, signaled the issue of Nazi war criminals in Canada was not closed, that the reality was that some alleged war criminals had settled in Canada and were living quiet lives concealed from juridical process and penalty for wartime actions. In the final time period, from 1985 onwards, Canada has more earnestly responded to allegations of war criminals in the country. A commission was established to look into allegations that Joseph Mengele might be living in the country and looked into legal options available for Canada to pursue justice. After the commission presented its recommendations, only a handful of cases were brought to trial for Canada's preferred approach of criminal charges in a Canadian court. When the case of R.V. Finta lost upon appeal and Finta was released, the criminal cases came to a close. Switching tactics, the state chose to pursue denaturalization and deportation against alleged war criminals, with modest success. The case against Vladimir Katriak is one of the several cases to go before an immigration court and shows that while denaturalization was possible, deportation was another proceeding altogether. Cases of denaturalization and deportation take time, rather a lot of time. And most of the individuals suspected of war crimes were not young men. In total, 26 war crimes cases have been brought before the Canadian courts. 4 of these were tried under the Canadian Criminal Code, and these cases were either withdrawn for ill health or lack of evidence or ended in acquittal. And the rest were denaturalization trials intended to strip the defendant of their citizenship. The failure of the Canadian state to act decisively by concretely and quickly responding to allegations has further fueled the divisiveness surrounding the topic. I didn't really discuss much of this division in my talk today. I sought to historicize the actions that were taken by the Canadian state, trying to grapple with the complications of justice so that perhaps we can also try to grapple with justice. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Katelyn. I will give you a nice round of applause for all of those who cannot, but I'm sure they are doing that behind their computer screens. Phil has the right thing. He has found the reactions at the bottom. We have also had thanks coming in via the chat. So as people have kind of a second here to collect their thoughts, I will take this chair's privilege and ask the first question. You said we could ask you more about Operation Matchbox and Paperclip. I am following you up on that. Could you tell us a little bit more?
Yes. So, oh gosh, where to even begin? This is kind of a giant story of rather clandestine immigration that is just so weird and fascinating. So Operation Matchbox in Canada was kind of a joint operation with the British to secret out useful Germans for use against the Soviet Union. So scientists, technicians, businessmen, lawyers, like all of these different careers that could have been seen as helpful were kind of secreted out. I don't know as much about the Canadian case as I would like. Records are rather few and far between. Something like under 500 individuals and their families total were brought to Canada. So not very high in number. And unfortunately, I know even less about the British system. I really need to get to the British Library to do more digging on that, because I think that's where the answers would be for Operation Matchbox. But in the case of Operation Paperclip, there were actual special branches of the American military that during the actual war were sent to different regions to try and find things that could be potential in future military actions by the United States. So sometimes that was blueprints, sometimes that was people. And some of these individuals and much of this technology was brought back to the United States under the guise of Operation Paperclip. For the science program, much of the space program had members of the previous German Nazi regime in it. And the Soviet Union also had their own program called Operation, let's see if my Russian's any good, Ovayakim. And they were doing the same thing, right? They were all trying to gather information and personnel to really advance technology in their regions, because that was one thing the Nazis were very good at. They had their rocket program was leaps and bounds ahead of where the Allied powers were in some instances. And they were trying to all play this game of who can get the most technology when and how, and that's one of the ways they did it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of these concepts which we see often in history, and which I have been teaching to my kind of high school, senior school age students this week, is the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Yes. And this idea that if someone has knowledge, you can look past the bad things they have done or are alleged to have done.
Yes.
So I don't want to get sued by anyone. You can look past that in order to do what is best for the country. Yes. And James no, go ahead.
I was going to say, and that kind of also was a part of Operation Matchbox and Operation Paperclip, right? Is the security personnel, so whether that was RCMP at this point in Canada, MI6, or I believe it's MI6 in Great Britain, CIA and FBI in the United States, they would also, some of these personnel were actually brought in to be used as informants against communist groups in the United States, in Canada. There was a really fascinating interview with he ended up being brought up on criminal charges that were later dropped due to his ill health, of an alleged war criminal in Canada. And he alleges that the RCMP sponsored his immigration so that he would infiltrate communist groups in Timmins and Sudbury, Northern Ontario, and these labor unions try and break apart the power of these labor unions, which is just also quite fascinating, the anti-communism angle that really happens in these cases as well.
So it's one that sounds so weird that it almost has to be true, because you wouldn't make that up. Yeah. And James has pointed out in a kind of comment to me that, as with Allied nations, the hunt for Nazi war criminals was pretty perfunctory. Eventually, the focus turns to the new enemy, and using West Germany as, in James's words, a whipping boy is no longer appropriate.
Yes.
And so that...
Yeah. Very quickly, the West Germany becomes the ally against the USSR, and the USSR was seen as a much greater threat. So what Nazi war criminals were left out there were like, okay, we're leaving you alone. We're done. And trials came to an end very quickly.
Yes, absolutely. We have a question from Phil here. He starts off by saying, thank you for a very thought-provoking presentation. First, there was a persistent myth that Panzer Meyer was smuggled back into Canada, given a false identity, and employed by the Canadian Army to teach winter war fighting. Is there any truth to that?
Probably not. The only record I have found where there's anything about it is actually in his own self-published work, where he claims that while he was in Dorchester Penitentiary, the military would come in and interview him. And I don't fully doubt that. I don't think that it was quite done in the importance he places upon it. But I really don't think he was smuggled back into Canada. He went up through the ranks quite quickly. For someone he didn't have much formal education in considering others of his rank. And in his mind, he was a military genius, and he did exhibit some pretty solid choices militarily, I would say. I'm not much of a military historian, so apologies. I'm more a legal historian. The military historians could do better than this, but I don't think he was one of those like military geniuses that he claims he was. So I haven't found anything in any of the archives to say that that is even close to being true. And most of the Canadian record about him is like, yep, he was in this prison. Cool. Send him back to, and like there was more discussion of we're going to release him to go than there was anything else, right? Like the returning him to Germany to the prison in Wörl was not seen particularly awful. It was when he got there and they realized that he'd actually been released several times to visit with his family during, like, I believe it was a parent's ill health and then his daughter's ill health or something like that. He was released a few times due to ill health of his family members under guard. And when that got back to Canadians, then he's being released from prison. And then he was very shortly after those discussions released indefinitely. So as many of the war criminals that were in prisons at that point were released. As this communist threat became more important, why keep these guys in prison?
Yeah, you almost need to kind of free up spaces, in massive air quotes for anyone who can't see me, to fit kind of the perceived greater criminals.
Yes.
And then the second part of Phil's question is, I'm going to mispronounce this, apologies. Monk,
I think.
Monk, okay. My German is horrific, is a complicated case. In Britain, there was a concerted campaign by a member of parliament, later a lord in the 1980s, to have him tried for the massacre of British POWs in France in 1940. The Farmhouse Massacre? I'm assuming that's a German word. One of Phil's Ministry of Defense colleagues had to go through the archives to try and find evidence. There wasn't enough to make a case against him. Sorry, the question has disappeared. To make against him, a sole dual-edged remark was the only evidence. And so interesting to hear the Canadian side of this.
Phil, I think we need to discuss this further because his is a case that I don't know as much about as I would like. Meyer and Mengele were kind of the focus of my master's work. And there was just so much more on Meyer. So that was where my kind of legal history-esque fell. But Mengele is one of those really interesting cases, right? Like even Canada, right when they were searching for him and Meyer, and the charges against Mengele, actually, he was alleged to have killed over 200 Canadian servicemen, prisoners of war. So his charge sheet would be, you would think, significantly longer than Meyer's just in the pure number of personnel. And yet investigations, when they wrap up, the conversation about him disappears as well. So it's really interesting, actually, that the British later on were like, hey, we need to come back to this. So we need to have a talk, Phil.
Yes, please do. I feel like there is a great collaboration happening right now. You are all seeing kind of behind the scenes of how historians work.
Yes.
We've had a question from James. Have you looked into the murders at the Medicine Hat, as a prisoner of war camp? The colleague of one of the convicted is buried in the cemetery not too far from James, and then further clarifies kind of post-Dunkirk massacre. Have you looked at, I didn't even know there was one near Medicine Hat. So this is news to me, but I am not, of course, a modern historian. I can see the wheels turning,
Yeah,
trying to find in the back of the brain.
Yes. The German prisoners of war camps that are in Canada are not something I've studied much of, unfortunately. That's interesting, though. Interesting.
Because
I
want
know,
to percolate.
yeah, because I know a lot of the Canadians were quite vocal about the fact that the prisoners of war camp that they had for predominantly German officers were shipped to Canada in these prisoners of war camps, and that they were some of the nicer prisons that they could be sent to, which still a prison, but they, right, like the one I know most about was actually, oh, it just left my brain. I'm trying to remember if it was Fort Henry or the Citadel in Halifax. Either
Fort
way,
Henry.
I think so. Yes.
Yes.
Was like known to have quite an extensive library for the prisoners and everything else. So, and it's actually also really interesting because I have friends who work on the other prisons that were the internment camps during First and Second World War, and those internment camps were, pardon me, my voice just decided to go. Those internment camps were actually seen to have alleged to have much harsher conditions than the German prisoner of war camps. So that is not something I study much on, James, but that's interesting. That's interesting. I bet there's a really neat legal case behind it too.
Oh,
Further conversations need to happen.
Yes. Behind every allegation in Canada is a legal case just waiting.
Finding the records is the trick, but.
Yes. Yes. The blessing
Yes.
and the curse. Absolutely. Yeah. Fort Henry had quite extensive prisoner of war setup. So Fort Henry, I'm going to bore you all for 30 seconds, was originally built to protect that part of Canada from a potential American attack. So it was built and now kind of focuses on the history in the 1860s. So when Canada has Confederation and becomes Canada, but part of that history is then kind of 150 years later is, I was going to say welcoming, that's not really the right word, is opening the gates to prisoners of war, and especially kind of internment of kind of don't know the specific wording in the Second World War context, but of these enemy aliens who are really just Canadians with a perceived unfavorable background. So we had kind of a follow-up from James of worth looking into. Die-hard Nazis killed less ardent believers, 2 of them, which is kind of terrifying that this happens on Canadian territory.
Can you send that to me, James, as well? Because I can't see that part of the chat.
I was like, I will copy and paste.
Thank you.
Well, so that you have all of this.
Thank you, Johanna.
No problem. So as we are kind of wrapping up, are there any last minute questions that people would like to ask? I will ask one to give people a chance to think on things and write into the chat. My question is going to be, as the British say, a little cheeky. Who do you think is the most intriguing alleged war criminal to have allegedly entered Canada that you have come across? Kind of why?
The Mengele case was really, really fascinating to read through. And a lot of that is due to the records that were available. Though he never did come to Canada, but you can have, like, the Americans have this whole archive basically on him and tracing where he was. And then there's a lot of forensic evidence about Mengele that is really fascinating to dig into, because they found a grave. There was a grave in South America, Paraguay, I believe. I should know this, but I do not. I believe it was Paraguay, because he actually drowned while he was swimming in the early 70s. And later on, someone was like, yeah, that's Mengele. Like, this was the name on the grave and everything else, but it's Mengele. So they did a whole exhumation to figure out if it was or not. And it shows like very early DNA technology was used. So that's really interesting. But in the Canadian context, I would say the most interesting case that I read through of those 26 cases that I alluded to was that of Vasily Bogutin. And again, a lot of that has to do with what was actually available in the archives. So for some of the cases I looked at into my dissertation, I went through the full legal cases. So thousands upon thousands of pages of the transcripts of these trials. And Bogutin's was one of the few that there was actually a taped transcript of this RCMP interview with him. And he just sounds like a curmudgeonly old man in these interviews. And like, it's kind of endearing, but also at the same time, you're like, oh my goodness, he's just like this like 80-year-old guy. He has no time for these like young guys coming in to ask him about stuff that he doesn't care about. He's completely forgotten. According to him, he's forgotten. And at one point, one of the officers, the younger one, is chewing gum, and Bogutin in the tape basically goes, "You look like a cow." And I was sitting in the archive and I just started to laugh. So for that reason, he's one of my favorites to read up on, in the sense that like you have to find moments of humor in studying these things, right? Because when you start going through these transcripts, you start reading all of these testimonies of people that have survived some truly horrific things. So for me, how I got through this was finding those moments of humor, and that was one of them. So it kind of made him one of my favorites in the sense that I'm just picturing this like little gremlin of a man that's just like, you look like a cow. So yeah.
It sounds very much, to put a personal touch on it, like any of our grandparents. I'm like, what are the manners of the youth these days?
Exactly. And I think that is important to remember, because it can often be forgotten when thinking about war crimes, war criminals, is that these are people too, right? Like a lot of the atrocities committed during the Second World War, and I'm not trying to minimize those atrocities by any stretch of the imagination, but they were committed by rather ordinary people, right? Like one of the most infamous books that I can think of is Eichmann in Jerusalem, The Banality of Evil, by Hannah Arendt. And there's a lot of controversy about Hannah Arendt's work, but she coined the phrase banality of evil, because these, like you see that picture of Eichmann that I presented, and he's just a dude, like he's just a guy sitting there. Like he's not someone walking down the street that you would expect to be one of the masterminds of the final solution. And yet he was.
Yeah.
So
they're not, they're not the person kind of in a 2022 context that if you're walking in the evening kind of alone as a young woman, you wouldn't necessarily cross the street to avoid them.
Exactly.
Unless you knew what they had done.
Yes. Well, and so many of them have families, wives and kids. And like, that is one of the hardest things I think about studying the Holocaust and being a scholar of that era, is you think about what the average person is able to do, and
It's, and I remember, I don't remember the name of the film, but I remember, so Katelyn and I used to be in the same place doing different degrees at the same university. And we went to see a film on the trial of one of these.
Denial.
Okay, there we go. And it was about this trial of an alleged war criminal. And what struck me was just, apart from the fact that you know what the allegations are and how horrific those actions are, you see them come in and you think, this is just an 80-year-old man. Like this seems like a very average person, until you realize that they're sitting there having a conversation like we are, but they're talking about the final solution.
Yeah.
You think like just the ability to put that together, this is a human, but also what have you done is so hard.
That wasn't denial. That was, it was a documentary that we went to see that was on, his name's also not in my brain. There was a case in Germany not too many years ago about an older gentleman who had served as basically a secretary at Auschwitz. And he'd been charged in the kind of immediate trials after the war, and then was brought up on charges again later in life as more evidence from the archive became available.
Yeah.
And he's actually a really interesting case because he's one of the very few, I would say, Nazi war criminals that has ever been brought before a court that sat in the courtroom and was like, yeah, please bring me up on trial. Let's actually have this conversation. Because for him, he was seeing the rise of the neo-Nazi movement in Germany as a repeat of what had happened. He's like, I remember being 18 years old and being that guy, and we do not need that to ever happen again. He's like, I did some crap things, some awful things. And he's like, let's have this conversation so it doesn't repeat itself.
Yeah. And I will just pull this up again. James has very helpfully said Oscar Groening.
Thank you. Yes. They all have Oscar as part of their name, so it's very confusing.
It's too much for my brain that has so much in it.
Thank you, James.
And we will have our final question. I guess it's a comment. I've accidentally called it a question. So yes, the accountant of Auschwitz. Thank you, James.
Yes.
Thank you, Phil. You and James have just pulled through and helped us in this fog. Phil also recommends The Stranger by/with Orson Welles from 1946 as an interesting read.
Yes.
And I guess we will leave the Q&A on a comment from Phil. There was an attempted breakout from a POW camp in the southwest of England in 1944, thwarted by MI5, but where SS prisoners killed at least 2 other Wehrmacht prisoners who threatened to go to the authorities. And this was later folded into the fictional 1970 movie, The Mackenzie Break.